So, hey everybody, welcome to the second winter event of our Activist Engineering series with the Inspiration for Activist Engineering. It's called Advancing Environmental Protection, Social Justice and Peace. And we're going to have this interactive workshop to really start asking questions and seeing where we can create action ourselves. This is a collaboration between ASCE UCI and AAAES UCI. My name is Keenan, and I'm the president of the UC Irvine chapter of the American Society of Civil Engineers.
And I'm Martha. I'm president for AAAES, the American Academy of Environmental Engineers and Scientists.
Thanks. And we're going to be facilitating the discussion tonight.
Right, so it falls to me to introduce our magnificent guest speaker. Everyone welcome Dr. Darshan Karwat. He is an engineering professor with a joint appointment in the School for Future of Innovation in Society and the Polytechnic School at Arizona State University. And he was a founder, or he runs Re-Engineered, which is an interdisciplinary group that embeds peace, social justice, and environmental protection in engineering. And one of their greatest achievements has been the creation of activist engineering, the inspiration for this series of talks, which is a praxis, that empowers engineers to advance values of equity and justice through their work. Yes.
Thanks, Martha. So we're going to start off the event going over the responses to the question posed on the Eventbrite, and we're going to pose some questions to you after. So, and Darshan, Dr. Karwat is going to take some time to talk about his work, and we're going to conclude with a collaborative activity and Q&A session in about an hour. So we just asked to please keep your mics muted, but you're welcome to turn your video on and feel free to ask questions in the chat. All right, Dr. Karwat.
Hey, good evening, everybody. Before I say anything of any mild substance, I just want to thank Keenan and Martha for their incredible leadership here. They're doing fabulous work at UCI, and if you're not familiar with what they're doing, feel free to reach out to them. Absolutely, you must reach out to them, in fact, to sort of get a sense of the array of activities that they are focusing on, trying to have us as engineers think differently about what we do and change the culture of engineering, which is something that I care passionately about. Now, in the invite, you were asked a question: who do engineers work for? And this is a word cloud of the responses that we got. And what you see here is an array of different kinds of actors, of different kinds of organizations who engineers work for, right? So we have the general public. When we look at engineering codes of ethics, right? There's this vague term called the public that is part of these engineering codes of ethics, right? What does that actually mean, right? That's something important for us to think about. Of course, engineers work for the government. I spent some time in the federal government before I became an academic. I was at the Environmental Protection Agency and the Department of Energy. And I also had some experiences in the private sector, not like full-time experiences, but I had an internship with GE Aviation, for example. Of course, there's many ways to think about who engineers work for, and the remarks that I'm gonna give in just a few moments here, hopefully give you a little bit more to think about as you figure out your next steps in your engineering career. So a lot of you are students and you're gonna be making some pretty important decisions about your life, about your finances, how you use your engineering skills. And a key question that you should bear in mind. A key question that you should bear in mind is who you end up working for, and how do you think about that? So let's go to the next slide.
Little bag, you don't see it?
Okay, we were gonna go to the Kahoot now to ask the question. The other question for the word cloud.
Yep.
So yeah, I'll put that up now.
Hmm. Okay. Yeah, so there's some overlap here between the word cloud that we saw just a few minutes ago. But there's also some new kinds of people or new kinds of affected parties. For example, the disadvantaged groups near industry, um, the traveling public. And that again provides just a little bit more detail into this broad question about who we feel like we work for. And so again, as I said, as I'm giving my remarks, bear that question in mind and bear that question in mind, particularly as it relates to the type of engineering that you are doing. Keenan and Martha mentioned that there's a diversity of engineers in the audience here. And again, the kinds of entities we work for may be different. So let's go ahead and get started. I'm gonna go ahead and share my screen. Can everybody see that? Wonderful. I just want to take a moment to acknowledge the moment that we're in, and I want to send my appreciation to all of you for taking time out of a Thursday evening to be here. This has been a wild ride for the last year, and I know that it hasn't been easy for many of us. So I do hope that your close ones are doing well. So as an aerospace engineer, I care about engineering. As a human, I care about what engineering means to society and the earth. If we take seriously the premise that engineering should promote environmental protection, social justice, and peace, and you might disagree with me about that, but if you do agree, then we are far, far from that reality. And so I want to take on this challenge about imagining and building an engineering profession that is motivated by environmental protection, justice, and peace by using the lens of activist engineering. And I'm grateful again that Keenan and Martha have created an entire lecture series based off of this term, activist engineering. Now, if you feel uncomfortable with this term, I hope that my talk will make you feel a little bit differently about it and hopefully a little bit more empowered by it. So what I'm going to do is try to set up a conversation, and we're going to have a Q&A afterwards. I'm going to set up this conversation by describing what activist engineering is, by showing you how experiments in activist engineering are highlighting the need for engineering to promote environmental protection, social justice, and peace, and by imagining how we could start creating a movement, creating an economy that supports engineering, that promotes these values. I don't have to go back home to Mumbai, India to find technological inequality and its interplay with poverty, environmental injustice, and marginalization. I simply have to walk the streets of Phoenix, where many still have inadequate access to energy services in hotter and hotter summers, or San Francisco, where the tech-fueled gentrification and rising poverty has shocked even the UN's poverty expert, Philip Alston, and this person has seen poverty all over the world. Or we simply just need to go to Detroit, whose planning and cars have created not only an American middle class, but also urban sprawl and inertia for mitigating climate change. Or we might go to Hale County in the Black Belt of Alabama, where even today, vast swaths of homes are not even built to code. So the legacy of engineering is not only replete with amazing achievements like refrigeration and computing and lasers and getting to the moon, but it's also full of mountaintop removal and poisoned waters, racism, and the continued development of the capacity to destroy life and the earth. While these are certainly issues of social policy, they are also issues of engineering, technology, and science policy. They are issues of what we consider important to invest in technically. And I'll go further and say that it also implicates how we as engineers justify to ourselves the work that we do. It's about our stake in the world that we are building and the future that we are building. So many blame politicians and governments and markets for the technically driven problems the world faces. And you can think about war, climate change, surveillance, disinformation, you name it. But why is it that there's almost always engineers and corporations willing to design and build the technologies that cause those problems, right? Many times in spite of knowing the negative consequences of those technologies. So to spark debate, reflection, and action in response to this reality, a few years ago when I was a graduate student, I started writing about what I call activist engineering. One of the many insights that science and technology studies has given us is that engineers tend to separate the political and the value aspects of engineering from the technical aspects of engineering. A great example of this is this quote from George Ishii of Cast Lighting, a company that in 2017 expressed its interest in expanding the US-Mexico border wall. And this quote motivated my lab's work on border walls, the social responsibility of engineers, and impacts on wildlife. And he said, and you can read it on the slide, there could be a political backlash, but we are in business to make money and put people to work and provide a good service, whether it's a wall or a substation or an airport or a prison. We don't want to approach it from a political standpoint, only from a business standpoint. Now, this is just one of many examples of such quotes from engineers and engineering firms working on the border wall. And you can imagine that this mental wall that engineers create in their heads to separate out the technical from the political, this mental wall ends up creating physical walls in the world. I'm trying to transition my slide here. Okay. Now, we know that engineering is political and that engineered systems reflect our values as individuals, as firms, as economies. Implicated in political issues like election security or disinformation and climate change are technologies, as I've said, right? Cyber technologies, deep fakes, fossil fuel technology, and so on. And by extension, implicated in all of these issues, because they're technologies, is the work of us as engineers. Now, our nation's response to the COVID-19 pandemic is no different, right? Our scientific and technological responses to it are seamlessly political, and the virus is making its way through a complex world of politics and policies and logistics and economic structures, all of which have been shaped by the design of technological systems, which by extension, again, is the work of engineers. So what values do we as engineers bring in our responses to COVID-19, right? For those of you who think about environmental challenges, what does it mean for engineering that impacts of a virus on our economy has produced cleaner skies all over the world than almost any technological system itself, right? As soon as the COVID virus was spreading and policies were changed, people started going out less. And perhaps you noticed in Southern California, the air was cleaner, right? So a virus has had that impact on us. And contrast that with all of the technological advancements that we've made about trying to create cleaner air, right? A virus perhaps has had more impact on it than the technologies that we've designed. The idea of activist engineering, I think, can help here. So activist engineering is about having engineers make explicit the values and the key drivers of why engineering is done, and having that knowledge shape how engineering is done. Activist engineering is about fundamentally redefining contemporary engineering practice by exposing the political and value-based nature of engineering, by applying social and ecological learning to technological design, and by imbuing a different sense of responsibility in engineers. Now, this moves the scope of engineering beyond solely technological development. The goal of activist engineering is to get engineers to ask and have a conversation about the question, and we can talk about this a little bit later, right? What is the real problem? And does this problem require an engineering solution? Now, if an engineer can answer this question, that means that they can confidently ask the question, and they have the tools to answer that question, right? This converts them from an order taker, which in fact, unfortunately, most engineers are just order takers, to someone who is actively engaged and who will likely have a vested interest in the system that they're a part of designing. Basically, we live in a world with a lot of inequality and injustice, and unconsciously or otherwise, it's a world that engineers have helped build. And so it's entirely reasonable for me, in my mind, to imagine engineering done to directly reduce inequality, injustice, suffering, and violence. And this is the opposite of the kind of engineering where the benefits of our work trickles down to those, and that includes non-humans, who need it the most, right? So think back to that world crowd. Who do engineers work for? Are we actually directly working for the people who we claim to benefit, right? So how do engineers push to make a more peaceful, greener, and just future possible? We engineers can help create, from philosophy to practice, an economy that supports such engineering. And we can't leave it to politicians or lawyers or business people who benefit from the way in which technological systems are designed. And fortunately, there's history to learn from here, and there are encouraging signs. So example one. Engineers in the past have struggled with these very issues. In the height of the anti-Vietnam War movement in the 1969, the MIT Fluid Mechanics Laboratory, which at the time had 3 full professors, 3 assistant professors, a support staff, and about 20 graduate students, this entire lab underwent a transformation. Its entire focus changed from fluids research for military purposes to 4 other fields: air pollution, water pollution, biomedicine, and desalination. And there are many more examples that we can learn from where self-reflective engineers and scientists took seriously the idea of ensuring that their work was for the broad social good. And they did their best to break the link between their work and the ability to harm others. Example 2. In 2010, when the Deepwater Horizon disaster happened, a nonprofit called SkyTruth, which was founded by a geologist who used to work in the oil and gas industry, questioned BP's and the government's estimates of how much oil was being pumped into the ocean. They did that by analyzing NASA MODIS and advanced land imager data. And what they found was that the flow rate of the oil spill was being significantly underreported by up to a factor of 20. Now that analysis put SkyTruth into the spotlight, and since then, they developed the tools to use data from satellites to monitor threats to the planet's natural resources, right? You can think about threats like urban sprawl, or fracking, or mountaintop removal, or overfishing. Their goal is to not just report on disasters, but to inspire a global movement where everyone can easily access these kinds of technological resources and be motivated to protect the planet from future catastrophes. Example 3. How do disparities in health, education, and access to resources affect the dynamics of economic and social systems that actually create conflict? Or how do sudden population changes like those that occur in disasters like hurricanes or armed conflict, how do those kinds of population changes put pressure on systems in communities that absorb that population, right? If a technological system, if a water system has been designed for 10,000 people and suddenly now there's 20,000 people using that water system, what happens, right? These are hard questions that are not entirely answerable by technological approaches alone. But we can see that in the very framing of these kinds of questions, Drexel University's Peace Engineering program is experimenting with how engineering tools and approaches, when deployed with a singular goal in mind, which is creating the conditions of peace and reducing the possibilities of violent conflict, can help us be prepared for turbulence in a world that is constantly in flux and which is going to continue to be in flux with issues like climate change. So programs like peace engineering can expand the definition of what engineering can be and how we use our skills. Example 4. Flint, you've probably heard of the Flint water crisis, Appalachia, around any most industrial facility. You can think about poor communities living around petrochemical refineries and incinerators, or even communities living around toxic Superfund sites. Many of you as environmental engineers might be aware of Superfund sites that are just highly polluted pieces of land that need to be engineered to remove the contaminants from, right? Any of these issues, take your pick. There are so many spaces in the United States where, because of regulatory challenges, a lack of socioeconomic resources, or a lack of political power, communities face unending and disproportionate environmental burdens of technological activity. Project Confluence is one of the main projects in my lab group, and it begins with the recognition that many communities across the United States face environmental, climate, and energy challenges, and that these communities could benefit from thoughtful collaborations with engineers. So how can we mobilize engineers to address these challenges? Recognizing that while helping one community is great, there are dozens, even hundreds that face similar challenges. So with Project Confluence, what we're trying to do is develop the tools and online platforms and processes to facilitate these collaborations between engineers at any and all stages of their careers, right? Could be students all the way to retired engineers, in a way where engineering projects are scoped to address the needs of multiple communities facing similar challenges at the same time. And we've actually already identified several hundred engineers across the United States who want to engage in this effort. And we've been interviewing community groups across the United States who really have a desire to collaborate with engineers and scientists on their challenges. Example 5. We need to bring light the generative work being done by engineers who are pushing the boundaries of the technical work their discipline traditionally encompasses. It's important to recognize those engineers who are infusing their works with greater attention to and evidence of peace, social justice, respect for our environment, such that they can inspire other people, other engineers, from students to retired engineers, to new heights in centering these ideas that I'm talking about: environmental protection, social justice, peace, human rights. The Constellation Prize, which is something that we recently launched, recognizes both engineers and thoughtful collaborations between engineers and individuals, communities and organizations who are striving to promote these ideals. Basically, what we're trying to do is to create a constellation of people and efforts who can help reimagine what engineering is for. And I'll be sure to have Keenan and Martha share with you the details on the award ceremony that we're organizing for next month. Okay, where we're going to be announcing our first set of winners. So from these examples, I hope you can see that there are experiments that are going on and networks being built to promote environmental protection, social justice, and peace through engineering. But the work is, in my opinion, still at too small a scale and still too slow. But the system that we're trying to deal with, the challenges that we're facing are massive, and issues like addressing climate change, for example, are just very, very urgent. So what do we need to do? And what might change actually look like? Practicing engineers, in my mind, need to demand a much wider range of options for engaging in society and earning a living than are currently available. Schools are doing, in my mind, again, a better and better job at educating engineers in systems thinking and human-centered design, in thinking about the environmental impacts and social responsibility of engineering. This entire lecture series is hopefully getting you to think differently about the social responsibility of engineers. But if you go to any career fair on a college campus, and I imagine that many of you have been in a space like this, if you go to any career fair on campus, and the vast majority of employers you see are the ones who are recruiting for jobs with descriptions that could have been written 30 years ago, right? And they just add empty words in there, like innovation or creativity or self-starting, right? Some engineers might sign up for jobs, and that's for these kinds of jobs, and that is fine, okay? There are different pressures that we have as individuals. But then how do we think about the research that is showing how engineers concerned for public welfare actually goes down as they go through school? Maybe they wouldn't have wanted to take a job like that when they started engineering. Maybe they came into engineering with a different idea about what engineering can be for. And by the time they graduated, their notions changed. There's nothing wrong in that kind of change. But unfortunately, the research is showing that concern for public welfare is going down as students progress through their engineering education. So I think there's something that is structurally wrong here. What can we do for those who want a rewarding career by applying their engineering skills in direct service of community? We can't expect everybody to be entrepreneurs because entrepreneurship requires risk-taking, and not all of us are in the position to actually take those kinds of risks. And that's because the shackles of student debt can lead to unfortunate compromises in your values, right? New engineers can be seduced by large salaries that are being offered by big oil or big defense, even if personally you might not support the work that your employer is having you do, right? And so this can lead to an unfortunate rationalization of your choices, right? It can make you think to yourself, well, I'm just going to do the best job to build missiles that only kill their target, right? I've actually heard that. I've heard that. Or I've also heard some students say, well, I'm going to just try to change the system from the inside, right? But are we actually empowering ourselves to make those changes? A few years ago, when I was at a conference on engineering education and sustainable development at the University of Cambridge, the two keynote speakers were from BP, British Petroleum, and that's because the conference itself was sponsored by BP. Ellen Williams was one of those keynote speakers, and at the time she was the chief scientist of BP. After that, she became the director of ARPA-E at the Department of Energy. And she talked about how BP looks for employees who can do interdisciplinary work, who see things from different perspectives. So when I asked her what would happen if a new engineer came in and raised social and environmental concerns, right, about the design of some kind of oil and gas infrastructure, she looked at me straight in the eye and she said, when we hire you to do one job, and that job is to make us money. It's only after you've been at the company for about 25 years that your concerns will be taken seriously. So let that sink in. Now, I can't say that I didn't appreciate her bluntness, because it just clearly shows what the system is and what we're up against if we want to try to change it. So I believe we will have made significant changes and progress in the values that drive engineering if any one of you can go to career fair and they take a look at the employers in front of them and they have a viable choice between working for, say, BP, or working as part of a small collective or a nonprofit or some kind of new firm that is focused directly on serving the needs of people who are not being served, right? An organization that uses the language of environmental protection, of justice, and of peace as core guiding principles to how they organize their engineering work. We need to figure out a way to pay competitive wages for this kind of work. Just a moment here. Okay. Now, another thing is that we cannot forget that most of the engineers in the world are not in school. They're out in the working world and they have a job, they have a mortgage, they have the children's college education to pay for. And a quick online search will show you how many practicing engineers are dissatisfied with the work that they do. A lot of engineering jobs take creative people like yourselves, talented people, and turn them into cogs in a machine, kind of like doing the same thing over and over again, right? With little sense of purpose. A few years ago, when I was an undergrad, I had an internship at GE Aviation in Ohio, in Cincinnati. And as an aerospace engineer, I mentioned that already, that I'm an aerospace engineer. I think turbo machinery is really cool, okay? So you walk through these vast assembly buildings where technicians are working with their hands, assembling these feats of engineering that lift us into the skies. And I asked myself, where are the engineers, right? To find them, I had to go into the basement. And there, as far as my eyes could see, I saw a cubicle farm full of engineers. And walking through this cubicle farm, I tell you, I had never seen a bigger group of grumpy old white men in my life, right? One of them said to me, and I quote, this is a quote, the person said to me, "Son, I just spent the last 20 years of my life down here. You shouldn't." Broadly deployed technologies, the ones that we are a part of creating, shape society by creating markets and regulatory frameworks and jobs. Each generation is born into different worlds with different possibilities, expectations, and dependencies, all of which is shaped by the work that we as engineers do. Let's just take the case of electricity and electrical systems. The life of someone who was born in the early 1800s, long before the electricity grid was ever imagined, was fundamentally different than someone who was born 2 decades ago. We now live our lives, at least within the United States, we assume that electricity will flow whenever we want it, right? That's policy creation. That said then, when our technologies are involved in humanitarian crises, as say Raytheon weapons are in Yemen, is it okay to say, as the Raytheon CEO said, that, quote, we are an element of US policy. Our role is to not make policy. Our role is to only comply with it. Is that okay? I'm unsure what engineering leadership actually means if engineering's role in society is to just simply comply with policy. Given the grand power of engineering, shouldn't leadership help us as engineers think about the possibilities of peace, of violence, of environmental protection or destruction we are creating through our work? If as engineers and corporations, we consciously did not create sophisticated weapons and bombs, politicians would be unable to order them dropped. So might it be possible then that a more peaceful world actually has fewer weapons in it? What does that mean for engineering? So let's make this personal, and I'm close to finishing my remarks here. If you are coming to the end of your life, what would you want to say you are leaving behind as an engineer? A legacy is something that is transmitted or received to us by our ancestors and predecessors. Now, each one of you attending this webinar, right? Each one of you is an ancestor in the making, right? Even though you're pretty young right now, right? But as I've already said, the work that we do as engineers shapes the future. So what do you want to leave behind? Better possibilities for environmental protection, social justice, and peace? More weapons and degrading chemicals? Basically, what do you want your legacy to be? And thinking about that now might help you think through how you use your engineering talent right now. To support these kinds of ideas, we can create more spaces and more places of work to have more vigorous debates on what engineering is for. To make the philosophy of activist engineering more practical, and to encourage more engineers to think expansively about the impacts of their work and the kinds of problems that engineering can and can't address, I've created a list of questions. And these are questions that can help engineers reflect on the social and political, environmental and ecological, and peace and security considerations in the work that you do. This list also has questions about incorporating feedback on engineering work, thinking about alternative problem formulations and approaches to addressing those problems, and addressing the personal conflicts that you might face in doing the work that you do. I'm happy to share that list with you. It's part of a paper that's just called Self-Reflection for Activist Engineering, and you can find it online. Again, I'm happy to email it to you. And in the Q&A, we can further discuss these kinds of questions if you're interested. But answering these questions, even partially, can help make it acceptable to ask these kinds of questions as engineering, right? I have a friend who works for a missile defense company. He's an aerospace engineer. He got his PhD in computational fluid dynamics. And he says, I can't talk to anybody at work about how I feel about the work that I do, right? So these questions, these self-reflection questions, can hopefully make it acceptable for you to ask these kinds of questions. It can help you understand how engineers and engineering may be implicated in creating many of the problems that we're now trying to solve. It can give you meaning to vague concepts like public welfare or sustainability in engineering. And perhaps more importantly, and this is an example, or the Constellation Prize is an example of that, it can help build a community of like-minded engineers to act on the dissatisfaction they may be feeling about their work. So here's my last set of slides. Here are the building blocks, some ideas for a movement to promote engineering for environmental protection, justice, and peace. We can better understand who is out there who wants to do things differently. Keenan and Martha are already doing a really wonderful job at organizing students on campus, right? We want to find like-minded folks, right? And what incentives they need to engage in this kind of work. It doesn't matter whether they're just entering the working world, whether they're just students, or they've been working for the past 40 years. I've recently started collaborating with retired engineers who have a lot of experience to share on how we might think creatively about doing engineering differently. We can create ways where serving those who benefit tremendously from collaborations with engineers and scientists is financially sustainable, right? We should not be satisfied with pocket change or always looking for small grants or just doing volunteer work on the side. We need to figure out ways to pay for this kind of work, right? So you can dedicate your working hours doing the kinds of things that you love rather than having a job that leaves you really unhappy and then finding some kind of gratification from volunteer work that you do on the side. We can figure out ways to de-link more of our personal financial futures as engineers from continued fossil fuel exploration, for example, or the development of arms and building divisive structures. And we can do so, hopefully, this would be the, the pie in the sky. We could hopefully figure out ways to address student debt while we are doing it. We need to think in that kind of way. What would it mean to divest our labor, our engineering labor, not just stocks, from fossil fuel companies? Perhaps this idea of just transitions, which is a framework that is being used in communities that have traditionally been dependent on fossil fuel infrastructure, right? Coal country is changing in the United States. The economics of coal are changing, and that's actually affecting the communities that were reliant on coal. So there's been this notion called just transitions that's been developed to help communities transition from one state of being to another, right? Perhaps that kind of thinking might help us think about how we do engineering differently. And lastly, we need to build a shared philosophy behind these ideas. And I think we can do so by highlighting more stories of the motivations of engineers being activist engineers. Now, all of these things that I've been mentioning to you over the past 20 odd minutes, 25 minutes, these are all the kinds of discussions that we're having in my lab group. And if you're interested in collaborating, just let me know, okay? Now, maybe what I'm saying challenges the fundamental values and the principles that guide technological and scientific investments in the United States and the history of engineering. But the world that we live in has in no small part been created by engineers. And engineers like yourselves are going to continue to dictate the design and development of technologies that shape human relationship to the earth and its people. So to infuse the engineer with ideals of justice, with practical tools to understand the impact of their work on people and the earth, and with the ability to work intimately with those who have different kinds of knowledge, is to change the world. And as I mentioned, I'd love to work with any one of you on this broad project. And so I leave you with questions that I think all engineers should think about. Why are we engineers? For whose benefit do we work? And what's the full measure of my moral and social responsibility? Back to you, Keenan and Martha.
Wow, thank you. That was so thought-provoking. All right, so now we want to land these ideas. We want to see how we can implement these. So we're gonna do this activity. We want you to brainstorm how or when you can use your technical skills to advance these values, whether it's social justice, environmental protection, or peace. It can be anything from a concrete action, or if it's just a field of opportunity that you can identify. So we'll be splitting you guys into breakout rooms, and each breakout room will have one of the values assigned. You can brainstorm for about 7 minutes. We'll let you know when the time is about to be up. You'll get a link in the breakout room that leads you to a Google Jamboard. If anybody is unfamiliar with a Jamboard, it's just like a whiteboard where you can drop ideas. It can be text, it can be doodles, it can be images. Yeah, so speak to each other.
Before you break out into rooms, I just want to say again that there are like-minded folks out there. The fact that you're a part of this conversation means that you care about these things. And so some of the ideas that you come up with, it may create connections with other people, right? So I'm here to help facilitate those connections if need be, but we should all draw on each other as a resource and try to make the right kinds of connections, because we don't want to recreate things again and again. Right? If Keenan and Martha have already thought about something and they can loop you in, great, we can accelerate change. So think about that. Think about what are the kinds of things you would like doing, share those, and perhaps we can start sharing resources that way.
That's great. Yeah, and afterwards we'll just come back and talk to each other about what we came up with in the boards. So make sure that you have someone assigned to speak about this once we come back. Yeah, so go ahead and join your breakout rooms. We'll see you in 7 minutes.
Hey, everybody. It seemed like such great discussions in the call. Martha, do you think we should do the raffle right now, since people have to leave?
Oof. Then yeah, let's do that and then do the
Yeah,
discussions afterwards.
Yeah. Okay.
Okay.
Hey, everybody. We had such great discussions that we saw in the group, in the breakout rooms. We didn't want to close it, but we did say that this event was going to be an hour. So we'll do this raffle, this Krispy Kreme that we promised really quick. And then we'll get to the discussion, and we will stay here until midnight if we want to. So there's 27 people. So I'm going to share my screen real quick. And so Martha is going to read on her participants list who is going to get this prize. So the first prize is a dozen Krispy Kreme donuts. So let's spin.
Did it freeze?
The number eight. Who's number 8?
Alexa Pelayo Hueso? Did I say that right?
Yeah, you did.
Awesome. You're the winner.
Nice. Okay, we'll write that down. Next person. This is the next dozen. Number 9. Number 9.
That is very close. That is Allison Tilsey.
Cool. Awesome.
Congratulations, Allison.
Okay, and the last one is a $10 gift card to Pete's Coffee.
A very loud noise.
That sound just it reminds me of a
24. Okay, 9, 10.
it reminds me of a Geiger counter. Have you ever heard of the Geiger counter? It's like, oh my gosh, there's a lot of radiation here. I need to get.
Who's 24?
Renata Langes. How do you pronounce your name?
Langus.
Langes. Cool. Congratulations. You're
Thank
now
you.
the owner of a
Congrats.
It was a
coffee.
great event.
Okay.
Yeah, thanks so much everyone for coming. All right, let's get to the discussion.
Yes.
Professor Karwat, did you
Yeah,
want-
open questions. Anybody?
Yeah, did we want to
Any
have
reactions? Am I you can say, hey, you're crazy. You know, no, it doesn't. Anything, any kind of reaction.
I have an idea.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for your presentation. I'm not an engineer. I'm actually a master's in urban planning student, but I think a lot about private versus public sector work in my field as well. And I've often thought about just going nonprofit sector because of these challenges. So I guess one thing that comes up a lot in my work, and at least in my internship, we have a very social social justice oriented company and we're doing a racial equity training. But in terms of our clients, sometimes we're not as selective as we could be. And we talk about raising the standard of like, okay, we're not going to do certain types of projects because they could promote gentrification or certain things. But if I weren't working for a company like this, I guess I'm curious in the engineering field, is it possible to propose like two different designs and say, hey, the advantages of this one are XYZ, and then maybe give them like a cost benefit analysis and show them how they could maybe save costs in the long run if they went with green infrastructure or renewable energy instead of the alternative?
That's a really, really great idea. And I think to build off of what you're saying, um, oftentimes I feel like we don't really think about the political implications of certain designs. And when we think about the built environment that really shapes our interactions in society, it can actually have, as you are well aware, have strong justice implications. And so I don't know the answer to this, but like I really wonder if there's been ways to talk about the the political costs of things, right? Like
Right.
this design has this political cost, this other design has this other political cost.
Absolutely.
Because I think that because image and brands are just so, there's so much value in imaging and like the brand that an organization has for itself. That's perhaps, it's perhaps worth it for them to spend more money to build their brand or to maintain an image. And I wonder whether there's a way to account for that in proposing different kinds of design. So you say, yes, this is $1 million more expensive, but here's what it means for your brand, right?
Yeah, that's a great point. And that kind of brings to mind another idea that I had during our discussion, which is possibly developing a different branch of the engineering firm that focuses on a very special field like, green infrastructure, renewable energy, or other technologies that can be more socially just, environmentally just. And that way they can use branding to kind of distinguish their two different branches of their firm. I don't know.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Yeah.
If anybody would like to share their screen and show off their team's post-its, you're welcome to as well. And if you just want to bring up those ideas.
So I just want to say, while there's a bit of silence then, that I made Keenan and Martha do a lot of thinking about organizing this event. And the reason why we're, just sort of at the very least, like trying to capture some ideas is because we need to start taking action. There's been a lot of talk about these kinds of things over many years. And in fact, if you look at the research literature, the kinds of things that I'm saying are like, they're not new, okay? And so I just sort of made me wonder, like, why aren't we doing more things, right? And just experimenting with things and see what happens, but bring our best selves to that. So, this little breakout that we did with capturing some of your ideas is just one way for you to just start thinking about like, okay, what is something small that I can do, and take it from there.
Darshan, if I might.
Hey, yeah.
My name is Doug Serino, and I'm a retired engineer. Before I retired, I was the director of program management at the Port of Long Beach. And to answer the question from Renata, I do think there has been a somewhat of a shift amongst public owners, and I can probably speak. I've been retired about like 4 years now, and I can't really address the current environment. But when I was working, I believe there was a very noticeable shift amongst the public, the sector owners, to become more environmentally responsible. And that reason was because of the license to operate that was being granted by the communities. The Port of Long Beach went like through that very painfully by having project stopped because we did not address those issues. Where that led us, and I think it leads like other customers as well, is to look at a project from a life cycle assessment kind of basis, where you talk about a project like costing $1 million more. That was always the standard in public bidding. But as I was working, I think we had somewhat of a shift because the projects were being stopped because we did not obtain the community's approval. And we thought that we could just like go ahead and build. What the answer was looking at a project on a life the cycle basis, which included the construction costs, the operations costs, and the demolition costs. And so we were able to justify to our board the added expenditure based upon the operating cost, over a period of time, and the environmental, the political, the benefits, and all of that. I do think most agencies are still bound by a low bid, and that's all that they can go by. But I do think there is, like, amongst the engineers and the management, like a desire. And if it can be justified that this project is better for the community, even though like it costs a little bit more, I think most of the agencies now will listen. And you can find those agencies if you're conscientious about that, and if I can pick those that you want to work for.
Darshan, this is Clint. Doug, I'm really glad that you spoke up when I saw that you were here on the call. I was kind of hopeful with your experience at the Port if you had any input on this. So Darshan, one of the things that we're seeing really pushed and advanced in civil engineering is the Envision certification, which is kind of like LEED for horizontal stuff in a very basic sense. Sustainability seems like it plays, if not a major part, at least a part in accomplishing the things that we've been discussing here. Mm-hmm. Is that kind of a good starting point, is to try and push and work with agencies to make sure that, Envision certifications and LEED certifications are part of the requirements for projects, or what would you see as being a step beyond that?
It's a good question. I'm not sure I can actually fully answer it. At a very superficial level, my feeling is yes, right? If you have a set of professionals who have gone through Envision training, designing something, at least you would like to think that is affecting their design choices. Right. Now, you'd sort of have to do a comparative study whether like people who've gone through the training are actually doing something different than they otherwise would have done, right, if they had not gone through that training. But one of the things that we're trying to do right now, and actually maybe it's already done and we don't have to do this, is to like start figuring out new kinds of metrics that directly target questions related to social justice and environmental justice and so on in engineering design. I haven't seen the full list of criteria or metrics or like the philosophies behind Envision, but you know, I don't know. I haven't heard of companies that are like really just trying to push the bound of corporate sustainability. I feel like corporate sustainability now in itself has become an industry that has its own stagnation. And so I just feel like there's a lot more opportunity in that space. But my gut reaction is yes, if you have LEED certified professionals designing a building compared to non-LEED certified professionals, my assumption is it's probably a different kind of design. I don't know whether that's actually true though in the end. And perhaps you or anybody else could sort of speak to that, because I'm not knowledgeable there.
If I might, once again, and I don't want to dominate this conversation because I think most of the people on the call are young enough to be my children. But I've been around a little while at this point. But I was also involved with ASCE on a national level as the chair on the Committee on Sustainability. And that committee was in a large extent responsible for funding Envision and generating that whole rating system and getting it going, and then it became an independent agency at some point. But to me, the benefit of LEED and Envision and all of that takes you back once again to the basics of why we're doing the job, and I think that's what Darshan had mentioned is like to go back and look at the actual needs that are going to be addressed by this project. The Envision rating system and others there's a lot more in it than prescribed like design methodologies. There's a lot of questions about why are you doing this project? What is the impact on such and such? Mm-hmm. And I think if you have at least that format, it helps you to get there and to think about the project in a way that says, why am I doing this project? What need am I going to address? And what's the best way to go about doing that? And so I think kind of in a way, when engineers kind of look at that, as a standard and let me go check the boxes, no, that won't be effective. But the idea behind it is to have the engineer and the planner and the owner and all of that really sit down and like think about the project in the long range, from conception through demolition and reuse and recycle. And like in my opinion and in my usage of it at the port, it did make a difference. And it also helps you justify the project and whatever expense there might be involved with the project. If I can give just a really like quick example, at the port we had there was an intersection that was flooding and we needed to design it, and I went to a design meeting, and when I asked the question, what are we designing and why are we doing it this way, the answer was the 25-year flood the standards from LA County. And I said, you all realize that we've got a global climate change going on, and those standards were developed for a different time than now. And what are we going to do to address that? And so I hope what that will do is to take the frontline engineer out of the standards books, out of this is how we had done this before. Let's just do it again, and like to think about, why are we doing this project? What are we trying to solve with this project, and who are we going to impact? And that's the value of those systems, I think. They can be misapplied, I agree, but I think that there is some value to them.
Thank you. Anybody else want to share some questions or reactions or motivations?
Yeah, actually, I'll chip in. My name is Steven Cruz. I work for the city of Anaheim as a public works engineer over there. And I think, don't want to harp too much on it, but I think one good way for college students to really think they can make an impact would be to work for a public agency, like a public works agency or a public utilities agency, because we do push for really the public good, and we do not work for a profit. I mean, that's at the very end, we don't. That is not the end goal of a public agency, whether at the state level, the county level, or at the city level. And I think the work that we do directly impacts the public in almost every single way, whether it's electrical, water, the streets that you drive on, the sidewalks and the parkways and the medians that people see every single day. I think it's definitely a career path that would benefit for possibly a few college. So that's my take on it.
Thanks for sharing. Kiana? Yeah.
My group got to talking about projects that are causing like displacement of people from their houses, and one of my group members was like an urban planning major, something like that, and we were talking about tax laws and how it's actually very hard to build affordable housing. And so I was kind of wondering, just as an engineer, how we can change those laws, I guess, from the inside, or I guess how do we work with lawmakers to change those specific laws?
I can't say anything specific to that, but what I can say is that engineers should be part of that conversation. I think oftentimes engineers say, oh, it's not my job to, think about policy or law or even code development. I'm just going to let other people do that. And I've always felt that, in fact, it is our job to be part of the process. So yeah, that's basically it. I mean, I think there's tons of opportunities. You might be one of the only engineers who feels that way in a group of policymakers, but I think it's important that you do speak up and engage yourself in the process. One of the things that I've noticed is that a lot of the people who call for social change aren't engineers. So the fact that you yourself are questioning, how might other ways in which society organizes itself, like taxes, right, and tax law, and like permitting, right, zoning, like what are ways in which we as engineers can be involved in those processes, particularly if you are bringing these values of like social justice, making sure that is affordable housing for those kinds of folks, because oftentimes the technical perspective is missing in those conversations as well. I've noticed that quite a lot is you have very well-minded, well-intentioned people lacking technical expertise from the engineering side in making decisions, and people like yourself can actually add a lot of value there.
Thank you.
Can I just reinforce that, if I might?
Yeah.
I apologize again for dominating here, but but that answer you gave is spot on. The engineer is the one that really the impact, of a project is only, well, can really be known by the engineer. There is no reason why the engineer should be excluded from all the discussions up front, because that knowledge that he has about how to construct and operate that project is essential in deciding which project that'll be done. And if I can strongly encourage all of you to seek after a seat at the table as the projects are being discussed, as that they're being talked about, the engineer needs to be upfront and be a leader in asking for a project to be sustainable and address the issues of social justice, of cultural impact, and all of that. You really need to, as an engineer, anymore have that passion to get at that table up front, because otherwise it's going to be handed to you and all of the parameters will be defined by that point.
Mm-hmm.
You really need to do that, if you can. I know it's hard, but you really need to kind of raise that voice up front.
And there's a benefit to that as well for you, where you are learning how decisions in city council are made, right? What the politics of that, right? And there's other ways in which there's sort of the transfer of knowledge and expertise and learning that's important as well.
And the value of that diversity of thought up front cannot be understated. I don't know how much kind of trouble agencies have gotten into by having a single-minded discussion about what's going to happen. You really need all the voices at the table, including, and most importantly, in my mind, the engineer. You really need to be at that table.
How do you get a seat at that table? Do we need to run for these type of positions as technical people?
I will tell you that of course, in my career, like I ended up at the end of it, being able to have some influence. But if you were to select, and I think, this goes back to a lot of questions that others were asking, is picking the company that you're working for, is to align the values that you have with the company, or the agency which you're working for. I know you need a job, but if you've got the passion for something like this, it will benefit you not just financially, but in a rewarding career, to seek out those companies that would have the same values you do. And all I can tell you is to raise your voice. Ask for a seat at the table. Don't be shy. Your generation is not at all shy. I mean, I have a daughter who puts me in my place all the time. And I would say, don't be shy. Raise your voice. Bring that up. Talk about it whenever these projects are being talked about. The old guys on the boards, they're not going to think about it. They're thinking dollars. You need to be the one that brings up these issues with the passion that you have.
There's a question in the chat. Is it moral, right, just, and effective to pay the people who work for general public safety? What are you trying to get at there, Jason? I don't know if Jason is still there. Well,
He's muted.
yeah, I guess it's 7:30 now. If there are any questions that come up, just feel free to email me and I'll do my best to respond. Again, just think about the folks who are on this discussion as part of a network that hopefully you can rely on as you're thinking through these important questions, right? Ask the questions, just as Kiana did, right? Just ask the questions, and that perhaps leads to something. I want to thank everybody again, Keenan and Martha especially for organizing this. And this is just the first interaction. I'm sure we're going to be interacting in the future as well.
Thank you so much for spending this time with us and answering all of our questions and sharing everything that you know. It's been great.
I don't know a whole lot, but yeah, so I just put my email address in the chat.
Is that ASU? Okay.
Yes, there we go. Yeah. Yeah, Martha, Keenan, we can have a follow-up conversation next week or something like that.
Definitely. Awesome.
Thank you. Yeah, I put the website link if you are interested in looking at Professor Karwat's work. We highlighted some of it. So
great.
Yeah,
again,
thank you.
Thank you again. Be safe.
Yeah.
Try to have fun as much as you can, given the circumstances. Yeah, we'll be in touch.
Yes. Thank you so much to everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you, guys.
Bye. Bye. Bye.